So the award that I am presenting today on behalf of the Board of the Society of Catholic Scientists is named after St. Albert the Great. St. Albert was the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas, and like St. Thomas, firmly maintained the necessary harmony between faith and reason. St. Albert played an important role in introducing Greek and Arabic science into the curricula of medieval universities. He emphasized in his writings the importance of an empirical approach to science, and he himself did original observational work in botany and zoology, especially in the classification of plants, flowers, and fruits, in animal reproduction and embryology, and in the study of insects. The Dictionary of Scientific Biography calls St. Albert's treatise on vegetables and plants, quote, a masterpiece for its independence of treatment, its accuracy and range of detailed description, its freedom from myth, and its innovation in systematic classification. It's appropriate that we give our first St. Albert Award to Professor Kenneth R. Miller of Brown University. Like St. Albert, Professor Miller is a biologist who has contributed greatly to scientific education. He is the co-author of the most widely used high school biology textbook in the nation, which has sold 4 million copies. So every author in the room now hates him.
But Mrs. Miller is very happy.
And like St. Albert, Professor Miller has championed the harmony between sound science and sound religion. One of the most pernicious fallacies of our time is that evolution and divine creation are incompatible. This ignorant view, held by both fundamentalist Christians and the new atheists, is what fuels the passion of both groups. The clamor of these groups, ignorant armies clashing by night, to borrow a phrase from Matthew Arnold, often drowns out the voices of more sensible and knowledgeable people. One of the voices that has succeeded in being heard above that clamor was Kenneth Miller's. His 1999 book, Finding Darwin's God, was an important event. It opened the eyes of many people to the fact that there is a middle ground in which stand many faithful scientists who believe in both God and evolution, including many scientists of high professional repute. For this signal contribution, the Society of Catholic Scientists awards him its first St. Albert Award. And I thought I would give him something tangible to remember this award. And so here's a plaque. Oops. And it reads, the Society of Catholic Scientists, 2017 St. Albert Award, Kenneth R. Miller.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen, and thank everyone on the board. This is a humbling award in many ways, not only because it's the first this new society has given, but also because of the eminence of the other speakers and the other people at this conference. So I really am humbled, and I thank you all very much. I know, being a trained biologist, I know what happens towards the end of the day when blood sugar is low and dinner awaits. So although I have a lot to say, I will try to be quick. And I want to explain how I got here, in a sense. I'm a cell biologist, and I work on biological membrane structure and function. I love to show the cover of Nature from 1983. This is probably the most fortunate coincidence of my career, which is the very month that I was coming up for tenure at Brown University. My laboratory had the cover story in Nature. And I made sure that every person on the promotions committee got a really good look at it. Among other things, and to any junior people in the room, I'd recommend timing is of the essence. So I'm sitting in my laboratory, and the phone rings, and it's a former student of mine from another university named Joe Levine. And Joe says, I have an idea. You want to write a high school biology textbook with me? And I basically, in my best New York style, said, what are you, nuts? And I told him to get lost. This is a very long story, actually, which I will not relate. But Joe, bless his heart, persisted. And in a flash, 8 years, Joe and I had a textbook, and it became widely known as the Elephant Book. You might wonder, and this was used in high schools all over the country, some of the younger people in the room may have had the misfortune to be educated in part by using that book. And you might wonder, does an author ever know what effect his book has on context and so forth? My oldest daughter, Lauren, I've been blessed with 2 daughters, managed to graduate from Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts before my first book came out. But my younger daughter, Tracy, was not so lucky. And for freshman biology at the high school, she had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's book. And I live in a very small town called Rehoboth, Massachusetts, only about 8,000 people. But for quite a few years, and at the time this book came out, a lot of people in the town knew me. But not because of what I do for a living. They knew me because for about 8 or 9 years before that, I was the commissioner, in effect, of the girls' softball program. So I ran the spaghetti suppers to raise money. I trained our umpires. I would coach one of our all-star teams in the summer. So they all knew me as the softball guy, but nobody really knew what I did as a profession. Then one day the high school adopted that as a textbook. My name was on the cover. My picture was inside. My cover was blown. And about a month, there are a lot of funny stories from that, but about a month into the school year, I'm driving up to the high school to pick Tracy up after field hockey practice. And as I pull up, there's a woman I know from softball, another coach named Bonnie Kelly, and she saw my little pickup truck and she got very excited and flagged me down, and I pulled up next to her, rolled down the window and said, "Hi, Bonnie, what's up?" And she said, with some excitement, "You wrote the book they're using in our high school now." And what do you say? I puffed out my chest. I felt very proud, and I said, "Yes, I did." Then she looked me straight in the eyes and she said, "Funny thing is, you don't seem that smart." So it is nice to have people to keep you grounded. But in the meantime, Joe and I kept working. The great thing about science is it does not stand still. You can revise a book, and finally you have to say to your editors, we have to tear it up and start over. And we've done that those times. We did it most recently in 2010, and we did it even more recently this year. And that book hasn't come out yet, but it will a little bit later this year. Now, the reason I show all these books is because they drew me into becoming knowledgeable about evolution. I'll give you an example of what I mean. The good people of Cobb County, second largest county in Georgia, adopted our textbook for their 13 high schools, which I was very grateful for. But due to public pressure, the Board of Education decided that all of our textbooks needed a warning sticker on them, kind of like a pack of cigarettes. And this was the warning sticker. This textbook has material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. It should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Well, a number of people in Cobb County saw that sticker, I think quite correctly, as an attempt not just to promote religion per se, but a particular view of religion to the exclusion of others. And they filed a First Amendment lawsuit against the Cobb County Board of Education. As it turns out, by coincidence, I was giving a scientific seminar in Atlanta at a university, and the lead plaintiff in the case introduced himself to me at the end of my seminar and said, "Our case is going to court next month, would you testify?" And I said, "Sure." So this was my first time in a courtroom. And as it turned, there's Jeff, he was the plaintiff, along with his attorney. And lo and behold, indeed, we won the case. Now, the next day, this is the AP story about it, and my name appeared in the first sentence of a story that was carried by more than 1,000 newspapers around the United States. You should have seen what my email inbox looked like the next year. I had many people suggesting where I was going to spend eternity as a result of my testimony in this trial. But if nothing else ever had, this convinced me of the passion with which people approach this issue. Now, why is that? Why should people be so concerned about a subject like biology? Well, I could give you lots of examples, but one of my favorites appeared in the New York Times just 2 years ago. It was a column by a very distinguished biologist named David Barash at the University of Washington. And you can see the title of his op-ed piece, which is in the Sunday Review. And he said every year around this time, this was September, by the way, I start my college kids off with the talk. It isn't, as you might expect, about sex. but about evolution and religion and how they get along, or, more to the point, how they don't. And Barash went to say, evolution is not merely a theory, but the underpinning of all biological science. I agree with that. And a substantial minority of students are troubled to discover that their beliefs conflict with the course material. The more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that living things, including human beings, are produced by a natural, totally amoral process with no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. In a way, this was the sort of lesson that the parents in Cobb County who wanted those warning stickers placed in our books were in fact afraid of. So to sort of think about, to frame a discussion of science and religion, I always like to go to what is, for my students today, the ultimate authority. If you can recognize the logo, it's Wikipedia, of course. And this is the definition of science, which sounds pretty good to me. And we think of scientific things in physics, biology, astronomy, and so forth. We think of some of the cosmology. All of this fits in to the definition of science. But religion, also according to Wikipedia, is an organized collection of beliefs, cultural systems, and worldviews that relate humanity to an order of existence. Now, those two definitions are different because religion and science are different, but they're not necessarily contradictory. And that's the point that I'd like to make in my remarks that follow. Now, the fact of the matter is that the culture that we live in the United States often contrasts science with faith. And I can think of nothing better to exemplify that than the remake of the Cosmos series 2 or 3 years ago, which was a wonderful series and starred the absolutely incomparable Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I love to see on TV and I'd love to see more on TV of as a popularizer of science. But disappointingly, it started with very much with a God versus science theme. And it highlighted Giordano Bruno, someone I introduced to other audiences, but I don't have to introduce to this one. Bruno was condemned by church authorities, and if you would look closely, these are all snapshots from the show. Look at the glowing eyes of the church authority. These people are demons who are condemning Bruno. In the series, he's depicted as a martyr to science. He's burned at the stake in the year 1600. And that's true, that's the way the series depicted him, even though the principal charges against Bruno were theological, not astronomical in nature. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't approve of anybody being burned at the stake, but to depict him as a martyr of science is really to misstate history just a little bit. But nonetheless, narratives like those in Cosmos present faith as what I would call the timeless enemy of science and reason. I'm not sure all of you can read the caption here, but here's a little candle in the darkness, which is a Carl Sagan metaphor, actually, and it's labeled science. And here you see eyes in darkness saying, hit it with your Bible. And that idea that science and religion are at loggerheads is very common in our society, and it frames a lot of the resistance to science. And there are examples everywhere that play into this science versus faith controversy. This is actually one of my favorites. And a friend of mine in Florida sent me a snapshot of this. This is wonderful. And I can't tell you how many times in public lectures to lay audiences I have been asked exactly that question. And I'm not the only person who has asked that question. So I have a stock answer when somebody asks me that. And that is, I'll answer your question in a moment, but first I have one for you. And that is, where did Protestants come from? And usually the person looks very confused, and I say, come on, there's the 95 Theses, the church door, Martin Luther. It was, I guess they came from Catholics. Are Catholics still here? That is the answer to the question. But the interesting thing, again, is that there really are examples everywhere that reinforce the science versus faith stereotype. This is a classic book, actually, from the 19th century, a history of the warfare of science with theology in Christendom. And for many people in academia, this is also how they approach this particular question. I think it's easy to say that the media, needless to say, absolutely loves the God versus science theme, because the media loves point counterpoint. And this is an example of print debate in 2006 between evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins and molecular biologist, at the time head of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins. And I'll mention both their names again in just a little bit. But as a result of this, there is shock and surprise when someone like Pope Francis endorses scientific ideas like evolution and the Big Bang. And as I'll explain a little bit later on, when this came out, I was called up by several media organizations, and I'm not the only biologist who asked me to comment on this incredible, amazing, shocking news. But the interesting thing, as I think most of the people in this room know, is that wasn't shocking at all. And I'll try to elaborate on that in just a little bit. So basically, what I want to address is that in the public sphere, and I speak in the context of the United States, the most basic question is what I would call compatibility. And what I mean by compatibility is not that science proves the existence of God. Many people mistake the idea of compatibility between science and faith as a scientist saying, I have empirical proof for the existence of God. That's not what I mean by that. But rather, I mean that science and faith can coexist in peace, respecting and even supporting one another. And the idea that science and faith support each other is a theme I have heard throughout the conference so far today. Now, an even better example of conflict took place in 2004 when the school board of a small town in eastern Pennsylvania, Dover, Pennsylvania, voted to instruct their biology teachers over the summer to prepare a series of lessons on intelligent design as an alternative to evolution in high school biology classes. And this was actually the sort of the varsity scoreboard outside Dover High School the day after the school board meeting. Intelligent design won, Darwin nothing. And one of my friends spotted that in a paper and asked me what I thought about it. And I said, well, you know, as an old baseball player, I'm very happy to see they at least made us the home team. And that means that we're probably going to get to bat in the bottom of the ninth. And as it turns out, we did get to bat in the bottom of the ninth. This is a news article. This was actually news all over the country. What happened very quickly is that a number of parents in Dover objected to this policy. They went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to federal court, and they filed a First Amendment lawsuit, arguing that this was an infringement of their First Amendment rights because it was an attempt by agents of the state, and that's what a school board is, to promote a particular religious point of view. Now, the case was called Kitzmiller versus Dover. Kitzmiller is the name of this unassuming woman here in the pink blouse, Tammy Kitzmiller, who was the first named plaintiff. And the case went by lot, because that's how these work, to a very conservative federal judge, John E. Jones III. He's a lifelong Republican. He was appointed to the federal bench by President George W. Bush, and he had a reputation as a strict constructionist. And therefore, the intelligent design people bragged in their blogs, this is it, we got our guy. We're in front of a conservative judge, everything is going to be fine. Now, this was widely written up. In the summer before the trial, Time magazine published a cover story on the evolution wars. After the trial was over, but interestingly, before the verdict, there was a remarkable article in the New Yorker called Darwin in the Dock, all about the trial, which is, to me, still wonderful reading in terms of capturing the spirit of the trial. And I didn't show them all up here, but in the aftermath of the trial, no less than 4 books have been written about the trial. This one by Edward Humes called Monkey Girl. It gets its title from the fact that Tammy had standing to sue because she had 2 daughters in the biology class at Dover High School. And the kids of other parents mocked the Kitzmiller kids by calling them Monkey Girl, because they said, your mom says that we're descended from monkeys, so that must mean that you are monkey girls. And that's the title that Edward Hume picked up. Now, the Kitzmiller versus Dover case fit the stereotype, as I mentioned, almost perfectly. I testified in the opening days of the trial. As I will explain, this is actually the NBC TV courtroom sketch of me testifying in the trial. The reason I had been brought as an expert witness is because what precipitated the intelligent design curriculum was in fact that the teachers had recommended my textbook to be used in the classroom. So they thought it was appropriate to bring in the author of the textbook to talk about this. And this is in fact my cross-examination. After I finished my testimony, I flew home because I had a class to teach, landed at the airport in Providence, got in my truck, drove back to campus. I turned on All Things Considered on National Public Radio, and the first thing I heard was, "It's God versus science in a Pennsylvania courtroom," to describe what was going on. Now, in the aftermath of the trial, the TV series Nova did a remarkable program highlighting the trial. Some of you may have seen it, but in the event you haven't, I wanted to show you the teaser from that will give you some idea of the drama of this case. I can tell that you think that narration was perfect in terms of drama. I discovered afterwards the TV people call that the end of the world or the Armageddon narration style. But this was an extraordinary program. It won the Peabody Award for Broadcast Journalism because it perfectly captured three stories. One was the First Amendment case about establishment of religion. Another one was the scientific arguments about evolution. And the third one was the personal conflicts between people in this almost evenly divided small town. Now the case went on, as it turns out, for quite a long time. And on the last day of the trial, and you've all seen trials, at least in TV, if not in person, you know that the attorneys for both sides get up and make closing statements. Well, on the last day, the attorney for the Board of Education got up to make a closing statement. And he had one of those Dayminder books open. And as he stood before the judge, before he said anything, he fumbled through it. Nobody knew what he was doing. And he looked up at the judge and he said, "Your Honor, I'm not sure the court is aware of this, but according to my count, this case has gone on for 40 days and 40 nights. And the judge, with the big grin on his face, looked down from the bench and said, "Yes, but it wasn't by design." And at that point, we kind of had an idea how the case was going to go. And the decision was announced just before Christmas in 2005. The judge ruled that intelligent design was not science. This was the lead story on everything from USA Today, front page, from there to the New York Times. It was the lead story on the nightly news, and it set off rejoicing among the parents who had filed the lawsuit. And I had to remind many people who angrily emailed me or wrote me that I didn't file the case. It was the parents of students, and all I did was to come and testify. And it was also interesting to me because when I went back, I had actually planned Monday morning the trial started. I was going to give my direct testimony in the morning, be cross-examined in the afternoon, fly home, and teach my 1 o'clock Tuesday cell biology lecture. Well, it didn't work out that way because my cross-examination went on and on all the way through Monday. I had to cancel my Tuesday lecture. It went on most of Tuesday as well. I was on the stand for 9.5 hours. When I got back, my colleagues asked me what was it like. I said, "Oh, it was no problem at all. It was just like having the oral exam for your PhD over and over and over again." In any event, the ruling was absolutely extraordinary. And I would urge anyone who's interested in it to read it. It's all over online. It's very easy to find. And it's extraordinarily interesting, scientifically literate, and genuinely funny. Because the judge cited what he called, and these are his words, the breathtaking inanity of the school board in pressing this issue forward. So I'd love to pretend this is all over. We've done this sort of stuff. But it's not all over. Here you see, Kitzmiller did not settle the issue. Texas, 2013. Texas is a state where the State Board of Education has to approve all the textbooks. And when they had hearings in 2013, they approved all the textbooks except one. And here you can see in the New York Times, they flag biology textbook over evolution concerns. I want you to guess whose textbook that was. That's our book, the Texas edition. But I have to tell you, it was quite remarkable because what the board decided to do was to submit our book for expert review to the chairs of the biology departments of University of Texas, Texas A&M, and Baylor for comment. And all three of them came back with glowing endorsements of our book. And in fact, one of my colleagues who writes a competing textbook called me up when this was happening and asked me if there was any way that I could get the board to condemn his textbook too. So in any event, the evolution lessons did stay in the book after review, and they're now widely used across the great state of Texas. And even this is not over. This year, these are all news articles about new waves of anti-evolution laws hitting states. Now, here's one. There's a South Dakota bill that actually, by its own wording, allows teachers to bring alternative facts in to the classroom that challenge existing scientific theories. And these days, alternative facts has quite a loaded meaning, but they wrote it into the book anyway, into the law anyway. Now, the interesting thing about Kitzmiller versus Dover is it wasn't a God versus science case. The judge himself is a Christian, he's a Lutheran. The 3 of the 6 expert witnesses, 3 of us were people of faith, and one of them, John Haught, whom some of you may know, is a professor of theology at Georgetown University. And of the 11 plaintiffs, 7 were Christians, and 2 of them were Sunday school teachers. And again, these were people who objected to the intelligent design policy for good reason. Nonetheless, I think it's still clear that scientific concepts like evolution and the Big Bang remain troubling issues for many Christians for a lot of reasons. And what I'm going to show you is a very brief clip from another NOVA program, this one from the PBS Evolution series in 2001, and I was a scientific advisor to that series. The last show in the series, as you will hear in a second, is called What About God? And for a lot of people, that does remain the most important question in a lot of ways. So how can people of faith reconcile themselves to ideas like evolution and the Big Bang? Well, I'll start with Darwin, and I'm not the first person today to quote Darwin. In 1879, he received a letter from a layman named John Fordyce, and John Fordyce asked Charles Darwin to confirm that a person could not be an evolutionist and a Christian. Now, Darwin was always polite, or almost always polite, when he wrote back to people, but he answered Fordyce in no uncertain terms. And he wrote, and you can see it right up here, he said, "Sir, it seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist." So Darwin called that suggestion absurd. And then he went on to cite an American. And the American he cited was Asa Gray. He called him the eminent botanist. Asa Gray is a scientist who should be a lot more famous than he is. He is, in effect, the founder of the botanical sciences in the United States. He started the herbarium and the arboretum at Harvard and at Boston. He was featured on a stamp for Pioneers of American Scientists, and he was also an elder in the Presbyterian Church. And he was really Darwin's first great popularizer and lecturer in the United States. And Darwin knew, although Darwin, of course, was no longer a Christian, Darwin knew that Asa Gray was. So he knew it was possible to embrace both science and faith, and he pointed that out. To go a little bit further into contemporary times, the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century was Theodosius Dobzhansky. And Dobzhansky wrote a marvelous article many years ago, and the whole message of the article is in the title. And you'll see this as a slogan in buildings. The Hall of Life Sciences in Notre Dame has this emblazoned on the floor. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And as a biologist, I'd say absolutely true. But when you read the whole article, there's an interesting statement in there. The diversity of life is reasonable and understandable if the Creator made the world not by caprice, I would say not by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. And Dobzhansky then wrote, "It's wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist," because Dobzhansky was a Christian. And he said further, evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4004 BC. It's a process that began some 10 billion years ago and is still underway today. Well, we can go a little bit further. What do the leaders of the Catholic Church say about this? A number of years ago, then Pope Benedict was cornered by a group of journalists, and he was asked about this, and he basically said it was absurd, same word as Charles Darwin, which I rather liked, to hold the idea that evolution clashed with religion. And his exact quote was, "The contrast between evolution and creation is an absurdity because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution that appears as a reality we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being." Popes tend to speak in somewhat bureaucratic language, and that might be difficult to untangle. So if that's difficult for you, do what I do. Go to that publication that, for me at least, straightens everything out. And that, of course, is the New York Post. Evolution and God do mix, Pope. And I think that nails it pretty well. Pope Francis, and these are some slides I made when Francis first was elected Pope, to sort of put him in perspective to people who did not know him. He's a Jesuit. He was originally trained as a chemist, so he's the first Pope to have real scientific training. Jesuits, his order, have been outspoken in support of science and including evolution. Remember, the Pope says evolution and Big Bang are real. I was called up, as I mentioned, when he made that statement, by a number of news organizations, including Time magazine and Newsweek magazine, both of whom wanted quotes. And what I told both of them was this was the least surprising news story of 2014. Time magazine was not willing to accept that. So they kept trolling for someone who would say how surprising it was. Newsweek, bless their hearts, actually printed it. And they were kind enough to quote myself and Professor Haught, the theologian at Georgetown, who was my colleague at the Kitzmiller trial. And again, their take was, it's not that controversial among Catholics, and that is in fact the correct statement. This is a British publication saying the same thing. This is the first audience to which I have spoken in many, many years, to whom I did not have to explain who Georges Lemaitre was. Pardon me. I'm sorry. And I point out that, in fact, the Pope's remarks are actually in keeping with the Catholic intellectual tradition that produced scientists like Lemaitre. And of course, we will hear more about Lemaitre later today. So, as many people ask, how do you reconcile science and faith, evolution with faith in particular? My friend Francis Collins, now the director of the National Institutes of Health, has a stock reply to that, which is if two ideas are not in conflict, then they have no need for reconciliation, so to speak. But in ways, that's too glib an answer. And as a biologist, I'd put it this way. Life is a material phenomenon. This is one of the few things, by the way, that Madonna consistently gets right. We do live in a material world. And the capacity for life is literally built into the physics and chemistry of matter. That means evolution is an inherent and predictable part of nature. And if the ultimate cause of the natural world is the will of God, then it becomes very clear that evolution simply reflects his creative power. So in a very real sense, there is a design to life, but it's not the one the intelligent design people think. In a real sense, an evolutionary design to life is part of the inherent fabric of the natural world. And the lesson, therefore, is the capacity for evolutionary change is built into nature, and that allows believers to see it as part of God's providential plan. One person who certainly does this is the very distinguished paleontologist Simon Conway Morris. Anyone in biology who knows paleontology knows Conway Morris very well. He is the person responsible for the fundamental reinterpretation of the Burgess Shale, which until recently was the richest deposit of Cambrian fossils in the world. The Cambrian period is critical for the evolution of the major animal phyla. Conway Morris upended our understanding of that in a very productive way. He continues to do absolutely remarkable work. He is also a Christian, and he has emphasized repeatedly the convergent aspect of evolution, saying basically that what evolution does is to explore adaptive space and produce organisms with a variety of solutions to being alive. But those solutions are dictated by the laws of physics and chemistry and by principles such as hydrodynamics, which is why large predatory animals in the ocean, whether they are chondriichthyes like sharks, whether they are fish, or whether they are mammals, all have pretty much the same shape because they're all shaped by the same physical principles. And he argues that as life explored adaptive space, one place it was going to find sooner or later would have resulted in intelligent, reflective, self-aware life, and that is us. And that, for him, solves the question of how could the Creator use something that seems as undirected as an evolutionary process to produce creatures like us. So I recommend several of his books, and he has a new book out, which is a huge tome that I've just managed to work my way through, called The Runes of Evolution. And it's an effort to look at everything in the evolutionary expanse, from plants and microorganisms all the way to animals. It's a tough read, but it's well worth it. Now, a couple of things. Every now and then people ask me, how do we find room for God in the evolutionary process? And essentially what they want to know is, how did God rig the evolutionary process to get the world we have? And my answer is, we don't have to find room for God in the evolutionary process. We don't have to find a way in which he bribes the referees or weights the scales to make things come out in a predetermined fashion, because the process itself is part of a natural world he made. And therefore these natural processes are going to fulfill his plan. Now, the question of what kind of God could exist in a scientific world in which nature acts according to orderly, predictable rules is one that's easily answered. And that is a God who fashioned a world that is both rational and intelligible. And that, in fact, is the basis of science. So to people of people of faith, God is not the antithesis of scientific reason. Rather, he can be understood as the very reason why science works in the first place, because there is a rational intelligence behind creation. Now, there are organizations like BioLogos and the Clergy Letter Project, which seek acceptance for science among the religious. And in our country, I think that's very much of a problem. And the reluctance to accept science among religious people is, I think, one of the reasons for the high rate, the unreasoning rate of skepticism about science in the United States. And they do this by, first of all, respecting the competence of science to investigate the natural world, by regarding Scripture as conveying a spiritual, not a scientific method, by not insisting that science find empirical evidence for a creator God, and finally, by an insight. And the insight, I think, is fundamental to all of us in science and our work, which is God is not in nature, therefore we should not expect to find him by empirical tools, but rather God is the reason for nature. And that insight, I think, is very, very helpful to a scientific life. And I would add something of my own, which I often say, which is that any faith requires the rejection of science is not a faith worth having. As Aquinas was all too aware, faith and reason are both gifts from God, and to reject either one of them, including to reject reason, is to reject God himself. Nonetheless, the argument that faith is a contradiction of scientific rationality is still out there. I've already mentioned Francis Collins. This is Time magazine from the completion of the Human Genome Project, in which he was a principal player. President Obama nominated Francis Collins to head the National Institutes of Health. The prolific writer and atheist Sam Harris then wrote an impassioned op-ed piece, this is from 2009, arguing along the following lines: that Francis Collins was not fit to lead the National Institutes of Health because Dr. Collins is a Christian. Christians believe a lot of really stupid things. Anybody who believes a lot of really stupid things shouldn't lead the National Institutes of Health. That was airtight reasoning as far as Sam Harris was concerned. I was very upset by that. I'm a personal friend of Dr. Collins. New York Times was kind enough to publish a letter that I wrote in the next issue in the entirety, saying that he was exactly the right person to lead the NIH, and I think the subsequent 8 years of Dr. Collins' supervisorship of NIH have borne out the notion that he's the perfect person to lead that organization. And not once during that time has anyone, even Harris, accused him of using his scientific faith to somehow deflect science from one path to another. He's been a great administrator. Richard Dawkins is someone who I consider a very good friend. Richard actually promotes my books in the United Kingdom. We've shared the platform together twice. He's actually helped me in terms of certain fundamental understandings of science that he knows better than I do for books that I've written. And I think in many respects he's a very nice guy. Now, of all the books he's written about evolution, which I recommend to anyone, his actual best-selling book is not a scientific book. It is The God Delusion. And this quote, this is sort of unfair to do, this quote is actually not from God Delusion. It's from River Out of Eden. But he's used the same quote in 2 of his books, so I know he thinks it's important. The universe we know from evolution has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And the first time I shared a platform with Richard, I read that quote out to him. And I said, how do you get up in the morning if that's what you think's going on? And you have to imagine this in the best Oxford accent possible, which is he stood up and he said, well, the universe may not have a purpose, but I do. But for me, the questions here are, how does he make that conclusion? Well, he would say, and he did say to me, look, the physical universe is cold, indifferent, and hostile to life. Ask anybody who's been to space, and they will certainly tell you that. And that's absolutely true. But one of the things that has me scratching my head was, how does Richard, as a scientist, know that the universe lacks a purpose? Imagine that I were to go to the cell biology meetings, which I do every year, and to get up for my 15-minute talk and say, through some experiments in my laboratory, I have discovered the purpose of life. People in the back row would be saying, come here, come on in. Miller's losing it. Because everybody knows that science doesn't tell us ultimate purpose. But Richard is invoking the authority of science to say that existence is without purpose, which is logically almost the same thing. And I would question whether purpose and even the term evil are scientific concepts or not. And in fact, one of the things that we heard this morning is the universe, in fact, contains the physical and chemical potential that makes life possible. So you could take those exact same scientific facts and the fact that the universe has given rise to reflective, intelligent, self-aware life on this planet, and you could then ask people who feel the other way. People like, that's John Haught, Francis Collins, Dobzhansky, whom I've quoted, and Francisco Ayala, another geneticist and also a Christian whom I have not quoted, and they would probably rewrite the Dawkins quote something like this, which is, the universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom the wisdom of a provident and purposeful God, intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world that would bring forth life, reflective, intelligent, and self-aware. Now, that's not a scientific statement, and I agree with that. But neither was Richard Dawkins, and that's the point, which is this sort of interpretation is a perfectly valid one to do on the basis of science, even if it's not testable by science, because it invokes words like meaning and purpose. Many people have asked me, well, wait a minute, aren't the physicists sort of zeroing in on an explanation for the existence of universes that frankly excludes a deity? And in one of Hawking's recent books, it was mentioned, Creation of the Universe minus God. This is it, the book, The Grand Design. Also, in this view, the universe blasted itself into existence spontaneously, following string theory's rules to create physical laws purely by chance. So in other words, here it is, don't need a God. What we understand about the universe actually does this. And Hawking argues in this book that there are rules of nature that allow the spontaneous creation of multiple independent universes. In other words, the multiverse. My good friend, and he really is a good buddy of mine because we made common cause when he was at Case Western in the state of Ohio in fighting for quality scientific education, Lawrence Krauss, who's a cosmologist and a wonderful popularizer of physics, wrote a book a couple years ago called A Universe from Nothing. And you can see the subtitle, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. The afterword to the book, and a very enthusiastic one, was written by Richard Dawkins. And what Lawrence had argued in here is that we now know that we don't have to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And Dawkins writes, even the last trump card of the theologian, why is there something rather than nothing, shrivels up before your eyes as you read these pages. If On the Origin of Species was biology's death blow to supernaturalism, we may see Krauss's book as the equivalent from cosmology. The title means exactly what it says, and what it says is devastating. In other words, we have closed the loop. We do not require God as an explanation for existence. Now, the interesting thing about this is the most devastating reviews of this came not from believers, but from atheists. And one of those was David Albert, professor of philosophy at Columbia University. And in the Sunday New York Times, I have to say this crudely, he tore Lawrence a new one. It's about the only thing I can say. Lawrence made a fundamental mistake, and that is neither quantum mechanics nor M theory can account for the mechanisms that generate these hypothetical universes. And what Albert wrote is, where are the laws of quantum mechanics supposed to have come from? Krauss acknowledges he doesn't have a clue. And he does that just a few pages before the end of the book. And everything he's been talking about simply takes the basic principles of quantum mechanics for granted. So even Lawrence Krauss's universe didn't come from nothing, it came from something. And he has no explanation for where that something came from. Now, Lawrence, I have to say, responded with an internet diatribe against philosophers. And he basically said, what have philosophers ever taught us in the last 2,000 years? And what is this philosopher doing spouting off about physics? Well, Lawrence made the mistake of not Googling David Albert to discover that he has a PhD in theoretical physics. So it turns out he knew whereof he spoke. And other reviewers very quickly chimed in. And this was a false start in attempting to exclude the idea of God from the universe. And Albert really nailed him on it one way or another. A couple years earlier, Paul Davies, another cosmologist, wrote a remarkable article in the New York Times called Taking Science of Faith. And in there, he related the fact that as a grad student, he used to pester his physics professors by saying, where do the laws of physics come from? And the professors used to respond by either saying, go away, kid, you bother me, or by saying, it's not our job as physicists to ask that. Our job is to discover the laws and apply them. But nonetheless, he persisted. And his insight was that something outside of nature is required to explain the laws of nature. And he says that science has its own faith-based belief system. All science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered in a rational and intelligible way. And if we didn't have that assumption, it'd be awfully hard to do science. And he basically says both religion and science are founded on faith, namely on the belief in the existence of something outside the universe, like an unexplained God, or if not God, an unexplained set of physical laws, and maybe even a huge ensemble of unseen universes. For that reason, both religion and science fail to provide a complete account of existence. And I think Davies' insight is worthwhile here. So I want to go back to my friend David Barash and the talk. And I want to go to some other elements of his argument that I haven't shown you before. Here's one. Evolution has demolished pillars of faith and an undermined belief in an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. And he basically, what's happened here? Let me try this again. There we go. An entirely random and natural and undirected process, random variation and natural selection, is all that is needed to generate extraordinary levels of non-randomness, complexity. Living things are wonderfully complex, but they're within the range of a statistically powerful, entirely mechanical phenomenon. Now, what is he talking about here? Is it really a problem to point out that life was generated by purely natural processes? I don't think so. Let me go to St. Augustine. The universe was brought into a being in a less than fully formed state, but was gifted to transform itself from unformed matter into a truly marvelous array of structures and life forms. So even Augustine basically says the universe is self-creating in many ways. So let's go a little bit further, and let's take another statement. There is no supernatural trait in our species. We are perfectly good animals, natural as can be, indistinguishable from the rest of the living world at the level of structure as well as physiological mechanism. So again, how do I respond to that? Is it a problem to think that we are an ordinary part of the natural world? Think of the book in which this sentence appears. Remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. Charles Darwin didn't write that book. The recognition that we are made of matter and an ordinary part of the physical world is in fact part of not just the Christian, but the Abrahamic understanding of nature as well. The more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that we're produced by an amoral process with no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. It is true that evolution does not require God as an explanation. No evolutionary biologist I know would say that. But there's a deeper question, which we don't usually ask in science, which is why should nature support the extravagant creativity of the evolutionary process? I would say that science really does not have an answer, but faith can see this and understand this as the work of that very same creator whom Barash believes does not exist. So what I would tell him basically is skip the talk, focus on biology. If his students truly understand the science, they will come to their own reconciliation between science and faith, a reconciliation that unfortunately Professor Barash believes is impossible. Rational science is inspired by a religious level of faith and conviction. And no one was more aware of that than Einstein, who was not a religious person himself. And he says it's true. Science is entirely independent of religious and moral considerations, but the individuals behind the great creative achievements of science were imbued with the truly religious conviction that our universe is something perfect and susceptible to the rational striving for knowledge. And I think that should underlie all of our work as Catholic scientists. My closing points are really very simple. I think faith suffers to the extent that it rejects the gift of understanding that science provides all of us with. I think science suffers by means of the deep hostility that many scientists display towards any form of faith. And finally, in reality, science and faith both arise from the same human need, which is the desire to understand. Now, I have to say, and I asked a few people at my table at lunch this question, where would you be today if you were not here? And any number of those people answered this way. They would be participating in the March for Science. I was actually slated to speak at the March for Science in Providence, Rhode Island, where Brown is located, but obviously I had a prior commitment to come here, so I had to beg out in Chicago. There was a very large march. It started, I forgot I didn't put it in there. Let me go back. It started at the Field Museum. I hope it drew tens of thousands of people. I'll look at the news tonight on Chicago TV, as you will, and hopefully it made the point as to how important science is to this country. Now, is it possible for activities like the March to Science to basically generate support for science and convince people whom we might regard as political conservatives that scientists are not all a bunch of left-wing liberal wackos, tree huggers, and so forth, but really acting upon conviction and in the best interest of this country and, more importantly, in the best interest of the world? I think it is possible. And I want to give you an example of a conservative who certainly has been convinced of this. This is Charles Krauthammer. He's probably the most conservative columnist in the Washington Post. I don't always agree with Krauthammer, but during the Kitzmiller trial, which I spoke about before, he wrote this marvelous column, Phony Theory, False Conflict. Subtitle is Intelligent Design Foolishly Pits Evolution Against Faith. And he wrote, how ridiculous to make evolution the enemy of God. And he went on further, what could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, indeed more divine than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct and yet interactive, all ultimately derived from accumulated variations in a single, double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas Board of Education. I'd love to end on that, but I have better words to end on. And I'm often asked by people, don't you find evolution depressing or demeaning or degrading to think that you're just an animal, that you had ancestors who crawled out of the muck and so forth? And the best words that I can find to answer that were written by a person who in 1837 made this diagram in his notebook. And it was the first sketch of this sort that anyone had ever done. And he explained down here what he did. And a week or two later, he went back in his very poor handwriting and he annotated it so it was very clear over here. And a couple of years ago, I actually got the chance, I had to put gloves on first. I actually got the chance to hold this notebook in my hand, which was an incredible privilege. And when he was asked the same question, you might say, at the end of a famous book that you've all heard, he responded this way. He said, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved." As I'm sure all of you know, that's the last sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And ladies and gentlemen, I take those as words to live by. Thank you very much.